think we're ready. People can trickle in, that's not a bad thing. Welcome back to the Long Tale of War Symposium. One of the themes this afternoon is returning home, and of course this Sunday, November 11, Remembrance Day, marks 100 years since the end of the First World War, and those who survived started coming back. It took a while for many of them. At the State Library of Queensland, there's going to be several events over this weekend. Special screenings here in Auditorium 1 of the Queensland Theatre Company's Black Diggers on Saturday and Sunday at 2 p.m. if you want to pop along. And on Sunday, November 11, there's a free family picnic out on the Maywar Green with the sausage sizzle and performances. Now, Associate Professor Martin Crotty is a New Zealand-born Australian historian at the University of Queensland, so being both Australian and New Zealand, his Anzac credentials are pretty good. Martin became first interested in constructions of masculinity when studying sports history, and his PhD thesis, Making the Australian Male Middle-Class Masculinity 1870 to 1920, was completed at the University of Melbourne and published by Melbourne University Press in 2001. He's been interested in the topic ever since, and all of this has helped in his subsequent work on the Australian experience of World War I and the Anzac legend. He is Associate Professor Martin Crotty.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'd like to start with three things. Firstly, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, and to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I would also secondly like to pay some tribute to the State Library of Queensland for their wonderful work over the last 4 years. I think historians are very fearful about what cultural institutions are sometimes going to do under the political pressure to lionise everything about Anzac, but I think that the State Library of Queensland have struck a wonderful balance between not upsetting too many people, but also telling very realistic, true and honest stories, and it's been a pleasure to work with them over the last 5 years. I should thirdly say that I think things have come a long way since I started teaching about Anzac nearly 20 years ago. I gave a rather critical lecture to students at the University of Newcastle in 1999, I think it was, and some of them weren't too happy about my demolition of the Anzac legend. One of them thumped the table in a tutorial afterwards and says, "What really gives me the shits is having a New Zealander come and tell us about Anzac." I said to him, "I'm going to use this for decades to come." Now, as we move past the end of the centenary of the war, our attention is, and will no doubt continue to be, increasingly diverted from the events that took place in Turkey and France and Belgium and Germany and plenty of other places, to what happened as societies demobilised after the 11th of November 1918. And demobilisation was no small change for these societies. War economies struggled to revert to peacetime operations. Civil rights that had been suspended for the duration of the war were largely, if haphazardly, restored. Wartime hatreds and hostilities cooled, even if they lingered. In many cases, new states struggled to get established. And of course, millions, tens of millions of soldiers returned home and were discharged from the services into civilian life. Now, it was at this point of demobilisation that the men who had actually fought the wars assumed a degree of commonality, finding themselves all in the same sort of dilemma. Their war experiences had actually been very different. Some had fought under the seas in German U-boats, others had fought at high altitude on what were then cutting-edge aircraft. They had fought in the blazing heat in the desert sands of Arabia and in the freezing mud of the Western Front. And most, of course, had barely fought at all, serving instead in logistics, training, intelligence, and a multitude of other non-combatant roles. Some were privates, some were officers, some had fought for years, others for weeks. Their war experiences were diverse and variegated, and no two were exactly the same. And yet when the war ended and the time came for demobilisation, these tens of millions of soldiers, sailors and airmen who fought in the World Wars, or in World War I, all faced essentially the same challenges. What would they do for work? How, if they needed it, would they receive more training and education? Where would they live? Who would tend to their injuries and their mental scarring? How would they make up the lost time spent in the services when they would otherwise have been advancing their knowledge and their careers and forming families and doing all of the other peacetime activities that they had put on hold and which they could now resume? Now, this was indeed a very difficult set of challenges for veterans to face. All the more so because they returned to societies that were weary, if not exhausted, and in some cases totally devastated by their war efforts. And all the more so too because of the number of other returning veterans competing for jobs, for housing, for training places, and for other scarce offerings. Now, many, of course, struggled with the challenge and lived much diminished lives afterwards. They suffered from increased mortality, from higher than average rates of unemployment, from PTSD, or nerves as it was then known, from war-related wounds and other ailments that required ongoing attention, from haunting dreams, and from restlessness and an inability to settle. The plight of such veterans and the harm that was visited on their families as well has been well explored in historical work by authors such as Marina Larson, with her work on the burdens of caring for damaged veterans, and Elizabeth Nelson with her work on interwar domestic violence, and it has been narrated in popular fiction such as George Johnston's My Brother Jack and Brenda Walker's The Wing of Night. These damaged veterans are not honoured for having sacrificed their lives, because they didn't. They are not recalled on memorials or rolls of honour as part of Australia's toll of some 60,000 dead from the First World War, because they weren't. But they are nonetheless among the casualties of war, and I'm hopeful that the ongoing discussions about events 100 years ago will extend beyond the end of these men's fighting lives and will encompass their return and their battles, usually successful, but often not, to re-establish themselves in peacetime life and to get their lives back on track. It is inevitable, I think, that the stories will be dominated by those who found this transition difficult or unmanageable, that we will concentrate on the legacies of suffering. This is because there is perhaps more drama in the damaged veteran moving from job to job and battling mental demons and physical wounds and perhaps never quite able to escape the horrors of what they had endured. There's more drama in that than there is in the story of the veteran who settled, maybe with a few bumps, back into the normal course of life. And it's also because there is a tendency in Australia to think of veterans as victims who stoically endure, rather than as warriors who visit violence. In fact, as Christina Toomey has argued, the image and the idea of the traumatised veteran has become central to Anzac mythology. But this does need to be contextualised, I think, if we are to have a realistic and rounded understanding of veterans post-war. One way to do this is to look at the sufferings of other groups. And Joy DeMusi, Tanya Luckins, Peter Stanley, Pat Jelland and others, for example, have looked at the burden of grief for family members, as well as other costs such as the caring burden, domestic violence and so on. Another way to contextualise the post-war battles of Australian veterans is to look at how they compared internationally. And what I want to do in my time today is to suggest that if Australian veterans had a difficult time settling back into peacetime for all sorts of understandable reasons, it certainly wasn't for a lack of trying on the part of their government and their compatriots. Because if we compare the veterans' lot in Australia to that of veterans of other countries after World War I, and indeed after the two world wars, if we take a sort of a slightly broader view of things, it's hard to escape the conclusion that Australia was probably a pretty good country to return to. Probably, in fact, the best of the lot. Now, no amount of government assistance and no amount of community appreciation could ever answer all of those questions that I raised earlier, which veterans faced on demobilisation. No pensions could restore amputated limbs, no ceremonies could banish nightmares and erase memories. But Australia offered its veterans more support from the national government than any other country. My talk today is essentially about how and why this came about. I won't go into the evolution of the Australian repatriation system and its benefits in its earliest years, but suffice to say that it developed pretty quickly from a notion that this should be looked after by the community as a sort of voluntary undertaking to a joint effort between the government and voluntary organisations or the charitable sector to really being a sole responsibility of the national government pretty quickly. So the federal government assumed responsibility for repatriation early on. It was also decided fairly early on that it would be administered through a repatriation commission that would supply a one-stop shop for veterans. And by late 1919, Australia's returned servicemen knew that their benefits would be administered by a body which was at arm's length from government, and that at least some of the repatriation commissioners would be men appointed by the government from a list provided by the Veterans Organisation, the Returned Services League, or the RSL. So this effectively meant that the veterans themselves had a say in how their benefits were going to be administered. By late 1919, as the rush of Australian veterans returning home from war was ending, the pattern of benefits available to returned soldiers and their dependents had taken shape. And it was really only, in most cases, a matter of detail that changed thereafter. And the pattern of benefits was pretty comprehensive and sought to address those crucial questions. Where would I live? Well, the Repatriation Commission included assistance with housing in the form of war service homes, which were available to veterans at discounted prices and with home loans at discounted interest rates, and furniture grants too to turn the house into a home. What would I do for work? There was an extensive system of vocational training, grants for tools and for starting businesses, and the public service gave preference in appointments and promotions to veterans. Who will look after me? For veterans who required hospital treatment, that was of course available free of charge through the repatriation hospitals, while those who suffered from ongoing ailments that could not be cured received pensions, as did those who were dependent on disabled soldiers, as did those who were dependent on soldiers who were killed. So pensions weren't just paid to returned soldiers, they were also paid to war widows, to the wives of men who married disabled soldiers, and so on and so forth. Veterans also received further material reward in the form of a war gratuity, which was payable at 1 shilling and 6pence for the time that they were overseas, and 1 shilling a day for the time that they were in Australia. And this war gratuity was payable on pretty generous terms, so that for those who enlisted early, it could amount to a very tidy sum indeed, over £100 in some cases. Crucially too, they also received ritual recognition and praise, especially on Anzac Day, where they were hailed as heroes who had given birth to the nation, but also on war memorials, on rolls of honour, badges, medals and so on. There were various other benefits that were available, but these were the core of them. How did these compare? Well, the benefits were far more generous than those available to people in civil life who faced similar challenges after, for example, industrial accidents. Stephen Garton has gone so far as to call this a system of welfare apartheid, one rule for veterans and one for everyone else. The Australian pension rate for a 100% disability was, with allowances for a standard family, and this is a crucial point that, where I might disagree with Bruce slightly, the pensions had been increased in late 1919, and once you added on allowances for wives and children, the 100% pension rate was very close to the average wage, whereas it was substantially less in places like Britain, where even though the base rate was higher, there was little to no allowance for the costs of supporting dependents. It was also generous in terms of eligibility, with no time limits imposed on when people could claim the pension, with a rule that the benefit of the doubt had to be given to the veteran, and with, from the early 1930s, pretty generous appeal mechanisms both for eligibility and for the rate of pension. And it was, of course, completely non-means tested. It's a reflection of the system's relative generosity that the number of pensioners increased significantly in the interwar period, and by 1938 the cost of the repatriation system accounted for just under a fifth of the entire Commonwealth government budget. It was also a much more generous system and a much more generous range of benefits for veterans than those available in other comparable countries. Now again, I won't go into the details, and to make comparisons across different countries is actually very difficult. But British veterans had a much tougher time getting pensions, dependents even more so, and they were forced to rely on charity to a much greater extent than Australians were. Canadian and New Zealand veterans appear to have been better treated than their British counterparts, but not so generously as Australians, while American veterans were treated far, far worse, with meagre benefits for the disabled and almost nothing for everyone else. So why did Australian veterans apparently do better than anyone else? Well, a number of years ago, 5 years ago, Mark Edelay and I considered this question at some length. We looked at the different outcomes for Soviet veterans and Australian veterans across the two world wars, and came up with a number of factors which we hypothesised explained the positive veteran outcomes for Australians, and which we thought could be applied fairly broadly. These were their volunteer status. Volunteers have an extra claim because not only did they served willingly, unlike conscripts who had to be summoned to the uniform. It gave their citizenship an extra premium, as Marilyn Lake has put it. The war's outcomes. Victors have a stronger case because they have achieved the desired goal, whether aggressively or defensively. The relativities between soldier and civilian sacrifice. We argued that veterans had a stronger moral claim on their fellow citizens if their sufferings had been distinct, if they had suffered and sacrificed in ways and to degrees that those on the home front had not. The existence and unity of the veterans movement. The more united and stronger the veterans' organisations, the more strongly they could formulate and press their claims upon government. The democratic or non-democratic nature of the government, because in total wars the returned soldiers constitute a large potential voting bloc and are able to exert influence through the ballot box. The state's fear of veterans, because in many societies veterans were a dangerous, unruly and at times violent bunch who needed to be appeased. And finally, whether the government had the means in the form of financial and other resources to meet the demands of the veterans' organisations. We argued that all of these factors ran in favour of Australian veterans after World War I, and that this partly explained why Australian veterans of World War I had the best repatriation outcomes across the two world wars that we could find. They were volunteers who had been victorious and who indeed had given birth to the nation, whereas civilians on the home front had faced no real dangers and had sacrificed relatively little. Billy Hughes needed them as a voting bloc to support his wobbly nationalist government, and the diggers were unruly enough, often enough, to make it clear that they might resort to violence if they did not get what they sought. They had a powerful veterans organisation in the form of the RSL, and although it amounted to substantial commitments, the federal government was able to find the funds for pensions and war gratuities and soldier settlement and repatriation hospitals and all the rest of it. This is a vastly, vastly different scenario to, for example, the veterans of the Russian Tsarist armies that went to war in 1914. They were conscripts. They had lost. The Russian population had often suffered terribly. Their war was immediately followed by the Russian Civil War, and at the end of that, the Tsarist army veterans were seeking benefits from a totalitarian government that they had not fought for, which owed them nothing and which had nothing to give them in any case. Now that looks to me like a pretty clear explanatory paradigm for why some groups of veterans do better than others. But Mark and I brought in a co-author for a book on global veteran outcomes, which we are close to finishing, and we widened our researches to look at a range of other cases following the two world wars. And we found some interesting outcomes once we started to look at China, at the US in more detail, at Britain, at Germany, and so on and so forth. Firstly, Australian veterans after World War I retained their position, in our opinion, as the best looked after veterans in the age of total war, although they are possibly equalled by American veterans following World War II. But secondly, there are plenty of cases of veterans being well looked after despite many of our factors running against them, such as German veterans who fought on the losing side in both World Wars, who had an appalling track record of immoral behaviour in World War II especially, whose sacrifices were diminished by the sufferings of German civilians, and who in both cases had to appeal to regimes other than those who had sent them to war. And yet they were still very well looked after. Or on the other side of the equation, British veterans received pretty miserable treatment after both World Wars, despite being on the winning side, despite being in a democratic society, and so on and so forth. While American veterans after World War I and Russian veterans after World War II received next to nothing, and so on. What we eventually concluded was that nothing mattered so much as the ability of the returned soldiery to exert influence and pressure on post-war governments, and the government's willingness and readiness to respond. So volunteer status, winning, the relativities of sacrifice, the moral debt, and all the rest of it, all of these things were useful when the returned soldiers, metaphorically or literally, sat down with governments to hammer out a repatriation deal, but they were all peripheral. It was the constant lobbying and constant pressuring of the American Legion and the veterans of foreign wars which eventually resulted in the GI Bill in the US. It was the inability of Russian veterans to organise and the totalitarian nature of the Soviet government that meant that they got nothing. It was the Weimar Republic's well-justified fear of German veterans that resulted in generous benefits post-World War I. And it was the late organisation and the insipid lobbying of an organisation too wedded to the powers that be that made the British Legion so impotent and which left British veterans feeling cheated. And in the final analysis, in my view, it was the work of the RSL which secured the best possible outcomes for Australian veterans. The RSL was an impressive organisation. It was founded earlier than any of its counterparts in other countries, which is quite a remarkable achievement given that Australians didn't go into combat until April 1915, and given the difficulties of federating an organisation across a nation as vast as Australia and its distance from the battlefronts. So to have the organisation up and running in mid-1916 was a considerable organisational feat which was unmatched anywhere else. It secured mass membership so that at the time of the most crucial negotiations with the government, it had almost half of the returned soldiers in its ranks. It formulated clear and generally defensible demands and lobbied for them insistently. It was well connected to government but never captured by it. It tantalised Hughes with hints of political support but never compromised itself and never actually delivered the support that Hughes was after. Billy Hughes, in this wonderful set of negotiations, which you can actually read word for word, because the RSL was smart enough to take along a stenographer and have their negotiations recorded. Hughes is giving them more and more and more, asking for political support, and the RSL holding it out, and then just whipping it away at the crucial moment. So Hughes ends up conceding pretty much everything that the RSL asks for and gets almost nothing in return. This is in late 1919. And it was also, I should add, very well led by this young man, Gilbert Dyett. In the negotiations with Hughes, Hughes had returned as a bit of a hero figure from the Paris peace talks, which resulted in the Treaty of Versailles, and was praised for his rather aggressive diplomacy. This 28-year-old captain, who was a veteran of Gallipoli, completely out-negotiated him at the negotiating table and got everything that he wanted, but gave Hughes pretty much nothing. And in slightly less salubrious fashion, the RSL threatened and occasionally employed violence. More than any other veterans organisation I've come across, the RSL operated intelligently, ruthlessly and persistently. And as a consequence, it secured a repatriation deal for Australian veterans that was better, in my estimation, than any other coming out of World War I. Now, none of this is to deny that veterans often found it difficult, for as I said earlier, governments could never answer all of those challenges that a veteran faced after demobilisation. But as we move beyond the centenary of the armistice and look at the way Australia readjusted to peacetime and at veterans' fortunes once the fighting had stopped, there are three main things that I think we should keep in mind. Firstly, the Australian government and Australian community did thank, did honour, did reward and did compensate Australia's returned soldiers to an extent unmatched by any other belligerent country of the time. Doubtless more could have been done, but any suggestion that the Australian veterans returned home to an uncaring nation should be rejected. Secondly, most veterans benefited greatly from this. Most transitioned relatively peacefully back into civilian life. And that they did this is a testament both to them and also to the Australia that welcomed them home and which smoothed their path back to normality. And thirdly, one needs to acknowledge that nothing could be done for many veterans. There was, of course, a feckless and ill-disciplined element in the returned soldier population, as there was in the Australian Imperial Force as a whole, as has now been well established. But for all the others, for all those who could never settle despite their best efforts, or who could never be rehabilitated physically and mentally, or who lashed out in uncharacteristic and inexplicable violence, or who drank themselves into stupors to dull their pain, or who committed suicide, they are the historical proof that war's damage can never really, no matter what efforts are made, be made good. So many of the survivors lived diminished or truncated lives, despite their own best efforts and despite the best efforts of the government and the country that had sent them to war. Some things were just beyond repair. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin, for that forensic look at repatriation. My next speaker, or our next speaker, is Michael Bell, who's been responsible for the development of Indigenous policy at the Australian War Memorial as the Memorial's Indigenous Liaison Officer. Michael's a Ngunnawal Gomeroi man who's been building a closer relationship between the War Memorial and Indigenous communities for several years now. There's been a big push by the War Memorial in recent years, of course, to identify and describe the contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women, and Michael's been a big part of that research. He's also a great storyteller. Please welcome Michael Bell.
Oh, no,
There's one there? Okay, good.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I too would also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today, and thank them for allowing me to speak here today. I would like to pay my respects to my Ngunnawal elders, past and present, and I would also like to acknowledge any elders of nations and communities that are represented here today and pay my respects to them. I'd also like to extend that respect to those that have served, those that are still serving, and the families and communities who have supported them and continue to support them. Just a warning that my presentation contains images of deceased people and also language that may be considered offensive. So just wanted to talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander repatriation and the effects of after the war for some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen. It'll probably be never precisely known how many Indigenous Australians have served, who are serving in the ADF and its predecessors. This is mainly due to the fact that race was never required to be documented other than that of natural-born British citizenship. Even today, in the ADF, ticking the box that asks, are you Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, is only voluntary. And it's also subjective. That subjective nature of that voluntary self-identification is becoming the topic of a hot basis within the community. But as in October 2018, we at the Australian War Memorial have identified 1,185 attestations or attempts to enlist made by 1,066 individuals. That's including second and third enlistment attempts, mainly successful and some under aliases. However, of these, the lesser number of 807, or 76%, actually served overseas, with 77 landing on Gallipoli and the remainder joining on the Western Front. Many of these who tried to enlist were rejected on the grounds of race, as it was the duty of the medical officers to make the decision whether or not it was to allow a person to enlist. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander soldiers faced substantial obstacles in enlisting, such as Richard Martin. Richard Martin, as with Douglas Grant, had to attest twice. He was rejected as Richard Martin, an Aboriginal man born on Quandamooka or South Stradbroke Island, came back and attested as Richard Martin, born in Dunedin, a Maori, and was accepted. Now, Richard Martin died in action at the Battle of Dernancourt, and we've recently embedded his great-granddaughter, Megan Cope, to tell the story of Richard and service as the official artist of the Australian War Memorial. And there's more to come on that in another lecture shortly down the track. But that restrictions, they were imposed from the start in the Defence Act of 1903, amended in 1909 and enacted in 1910 in Section 61. Section 61 included Clause H. And Clause H was the defining recruitment and ability to attest into the AIF, and it included a number of items. The one that I'm going to be looking at today is this one. Persons who are not substantially of European origin or descent, of which the medical authorities appoint under the regulations shall not, and they shall be the judges. Now that was the basis of the commonly held, previously belief and myths in the community that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men didn't serve in the first AIF. And that was taught in the curriculum in schools up to the 1970s. But fortunately, the research and the ongoing recognition and identification of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are starting to resolve that, and the current efforts at the Australian War Memorial and other institutions like the ANU's Serving Country Project, a couple of publications that have now been released on that research, are starting to change those stories. But it was in 2014 when NAIDOC's theme was Serving Country started the ball rolling on greater recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen. But this is the act, the section of the Defence Act that was held up against our men. But not only that, we faced other additional restrictions, and that was differently state by state. And in the instructions, and what we find here, the enlisting, in the general enlisting instructions for recruiters, and there's a copy of a standard one there. That was in March 1916. But in 1917, the military had decided that they needed to stop refusing fit, able men. Conscription had been beaten, and the draw on the resources were greater than ever. With our massive losses in the 1916 on the Western Front, the need for human resources and people were great. So the military order actually created this order despite the legislation. It's referred to now as the half-caste rule. And I do apologise for the use of language, but it's language of the time and it's actually written. And that's basically what it says. Half-caste may be enlisted in the Australian Imperial Forces, provided the examining medical officer are satisfied that one of the parents is of European origin. So, in direct opposition to the legislation, that order is now starting to change attestations, although our numbers of attestations didn't go up. There is a slight spike in the numbers that you may or may not see in another presentation by Joan, but that is in relation to 16 men from Cherbourg Mission or Baramba Mission being enlisted on the one day just after the legislation came in. Unfortunately, Joan's chart doesn't indicate that those men were secretly rejected from service 4 days later and taken back to Cherbourg Mission under police escort. So there is a spike, but it's a bit of a misnomer. The real restrictions came under the state authority and the protection of Aboriginals. In Queensland, it was the Aboriginal Protections and Restrictions of the Sale of Opium Act, 1897. This was the act that governed Aboriginal communities and people. And there was one of these individual protectors in all states except Tasmania, because it was commonly held that no Aboriginal people were living in Tasmania or survived in Tasmania, which, and again, we now know that not to be true. But these are the defining moments of the Act. It defines Aboriginality, and it then attempts to separate full-bloods and half-castes, but it also sets out the power that the protector had. He controlled movements, he controlled wages, he had the ability to care for your child. These are the acts in the states that led to what was now commonly known as the stolen generations. If you railed against this, you were moved from your mission, often at night, with no explanation. You were moved to a place, more commonly or not, Palm Island, because people were at Palm Island was an Aboriginal jail. It's now recognised as a community, but it was an Aboriginal jail for people who railed against a protector and or other objects, they wanted to be fed properly or wanted to care for their own children, wanted to marry somebody they loved. These are the controls that the protector had, and it controlled the ability of our men to serve, because if you got caught off the mission and or station without permission, you were jailed. So the risk to leave your mission to go to an attestation statement was great on our men. And fortunately, we've got a feature here of Douglas Grant. We've heard a little bit about Douglas this morning, and it's a unique perspective with Douglas. Everybody chooses Douglas, and I've chosen Douglas because he's a Queenslander. He's actually, he was taken, or he was adopted. We'll say adopted because he was documented as probably the only survivor of a colonial massacre that took place up in in Queensland on the ranges. Now Douglas, we don't have his traditional land or his clan group, as because most of the people that were participants didn't survive. Douglas's story is lost, and the potential communities that it could come from don't have the ability to say he is from their mob. That gets lost in Douglas's story. Douglas gets raised, as you rightly say, by a lovely Scottish man, a scientist who was collecting specimens for the Museum of Australia, and he gets the privilege of that, but he also loses his language. He loses his culture. He's too black to be white and he's too white to be black. And he lives in two worlds. Now Douglas goes on to be a great warrior and a soldier. He advocates for the rights of Aboriginal servicemen and using that ability and his membership of the AIF to get citizenship. Unfortunately, that fell on deaf ears. And despite the well-meaning of the RSL, all the state branches passing recommendations that Aboriginal people receive citizenship, Aboriginal soldiers from the AIF and second AIF receive citizenship, it didn't happen. And here's Douglas with his bridge that he made at Callan Park, and there's a lot about Douglas. It's behind the line. Douglas's story is held in 4 or 5 different ways, and people use his story to tell the story that they want to get at, such as Dr. Gates here this morning. He focused on Douglas as one of his 100 stories, because he's a well-documented story. But Douglas, in doing the research, the survival of the massacre is held as it's an intertribal dispute, the first readings in the paper. And then it was a dispute with some miners. And then it was a dispute with the police. And then it was a dispute with the miners and the police and the Aboriginal community. And it's basically used the story that you want to pick. And Douglas's is the same throughout his life. His occupation at Callan Park is listed as he was a clerk at Callan Park. Or was he a resident? It's unclear. Choose the story that fits your narrative. And this is the problem. We know he was Aboriginal, we know he was first AIF, we know he was in a prison camp. But what often gets forgotten is that he was in there with another Aboriginal man in that same prison camp with Roland Wenzel Carter. But we forget about Roland and we concentrate on Douglas, because Douglas had the ability to write and express himself, I presume. And that leads us to our good friend Thomas Samuels. Now, Thomas Samuels is another Queensland serviceman who enlisted, and he's a lovely young man, doing his best, 21 years, 2 months. He was born on 15th of July 1896, he's a labourer, and he's working. Now, Thomas's story gets a little bit murky when you go here. His complexion is dark, he's a half-caste. Dark brown, black and curly. Have you got the image of Thomas in your mind? Thomas is discharged, irregularly enlisted, having been irregularly enlisted. He's clearly not medically unfit, because they've gone to pains to cross that out. But I cast your mind to the date, October 12, 1917. That's 6 months after the half-caste legislation. And here's Douglas's medical history on his discharge. It's a detailed medical history of an invalid. I can't get your mind to have a look at poor old Thomas's disease or disability. How do I go back? His disease or disability is no European parentage. He's had this from birth. And the place of his disability is Queensland. Unfortunately, it's a terminal disease for poor old Thomas. But you see here, and here's the cause of his disease. His father is a South Sea Islander, and his mother is an Australian half-caste. So there's the cause of his disease. But he was of good conduct, and he wasn't medically unfit. So just to get you to think about that. A fit young man, 21 years old, at the height of the need of the AIF, he gets rejected, and his condition prior to it is he's not going to get a pension, as Doctor talked of, because his condition was prior to enlistment. And his disease is insufficient European parentage. I just cast your mind to any medical professionals in here. Would you write that on a form today? And just to cover my point, here's another discharge certificate of an Aboriginal man. He's William Hillett. And he finds that he's unfit for active service, unsuitable physique, Aboriginal. Just to say there's no doubt. But on the upside, we talk about another Queenslander here, and we talk about Augustus Davies. Now, Augustus is a success story. He has a standard career. He comes home from the AIF. Augustus also, he was born in Port Douglas in about 1880, and shortly after, just 3 weeks after his birth, his mum passes away, leading him to be adopted by her employers, Thomas Clinton and Mary Jane Davies. Now, this is a benefit to him because he's a banker. And the same as Douglas, he gets the opportunities of an education, a good upbringing, healthy life, and is encouraged to participate in society. So he goes off, and as all good young men do, he signs up in the first AIF in May 1917, which is again just after the Haas-Caste rule, and he gets in, and he'd had his wife and 2 sons. He returned home, and his family became one of the few Indigenous servicemen at the moment that we've identified to be granted a soldier settlement allotment at Wyampa in Bald Hills. As with this program, the land that you received was average at best, and the bit of land that Uncle got, it was a tidal marshland, almost unapproachable by road, not suitable for farming, and barely suitable for a residence. That was a block of land they gave him. And race has nothing to do with the allocation of that land. It could have been any soldier got that same block. And another paper we will discuss is the second disposition of our people as the resumption of Aboriginal Crown lands for the use of soldier settlement blocks, and then the refusal to give Aboriginal soldiers from that area those lands. Different paper again. Jane, you may get the paper out of that one too. But the soldier settlement scheme across Australia is an area that needs to be researched. But you will often refer to that the soldier settlement scheme was racist because of Aboriginal soldiers didn't get them. That's not entirely true. We've got about 40 Aboriginal soldiers, first AIF, that have received soldier settlement blocks or equivalencies within their various states and state variations. Each state run their own scheme, and applications were different, and the usage of that land and benefits from that land are wide and varied. So, again, I'm not an academic and or historian, but I'm just saying what I know. So Davies held on to his land, and it's still occupied today. Despite this, Uncle was still required to pay an annual rent per year per acre. And it was, whether it was usable or not, that burden he held on to, and no doubt through his family connections and other means, he worked and toiled, and he turned it into a viable ongoing concern. Davies and his family toughed it out, making a living on the nearby Pine River with hire boat business. And I'm told that the descendants can still be found there today. And they've dedicated Gus Davies Park, pictured at the Charlock Road, Ball Hills. That's a park there. Although probably not technically a memorial, but it is recognition of an Aboriginal serviceman and his willingness to get on under the harsh conditions. Now, so much so, the middle picture here of Gus Davies is from his attestation in the Second World War. So he lines up again. He volunteered for service during the Second World War, but with the Garrison Battalion. He didn't see active service. He marched in almost every Anzac parade, and it was a regular at the RNA showgrounds, featuring in several newspaper articles on these days. Uncle died in 1955 at the age of 72. So here's a success story. Douglas's medical conditions and lack of support, despite being an executive member of his local Lithgow RSL, he gets the burden. Douglas is carrying the burden of being the model Aboriginal. He was held up and touted as, see what you can do with an Aboriginal if you educate him. And whether the burden of war, the burden of being the model Aboriginal, or the burden of no culture, no connection, no language, no family. These are in total, the sums we need to look at, and look at the man not with the objectives of using him as a memorial or using his service as a wonderful story because we've got some wonderful photos, but we need to look at the man. And the memorials around, as we say, the community ones are more touching because they look at the individual. And it's in those individual memorials we can reflect on the individual stories. And that's probably why the Anzac legend will be untouchable by historians and politicians, because the people carry it in their hearts. It's a connection to the people. We talk about the commemoration of service, the commitment of their service, the dedication to their country, to their family, to defend country. That's just my view, but I'm not an academic. Other more regularly and famously advertised Australian Aboriginal soldiers were the Light Horsemen. The 20th reinforcements of the 11th Light Horse, known as the Black Watch. About 38 of the men in this reinforcement group are Aboriginal men from Queensland, and they form a part of the first empty saddles. These guys get great recognition because we've got beautiful photos. And I'd like to thank the State Library for having me up here today, and also their display and the previous talk that I've done. They've done a great work. Uncle Des Crump and the team and the Indigenous unit at the Queensland State Library have brought these stories to life. But they've based it on the individual, and they tell the individual story. And that's where we need to concentrate. Not on bricks and mortar. It's the individual, it's the spirit that we miss. It's the story of the people. And it's the story of us as Australia, even though that can be told in greater detail and in greater variance. Just before I leave, I'll leave you with this, a little chart that's gone up in 1963. Some of us may remember this, some of us may not. But this is the society that our Australian Aboriginal soldiers came back to, both first and second AIF. and to make you to consider why would they serve? Why did they serve? There's another topic, Joan. Answer that question and we'll be going all right. We'll write a book together. But thank you very much. I'm going a little bit over time.
Thanks, Michael. We'll get back to Michael Bell a bit later and ask some questions. We're going to